Thanks for tuning in to Causes That Matter. I'm your host, Dr. Tico Hardy, licensed clinical social worker, and we're going to dig deeper into issues pertaining to social justice, such as race, religion, politics, and so much more. I'm passionate about having courageous conversations in a civilized manner. Let's dive in.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to Causes That Matters. Today, we're going to be talking about something extremely important, and this is the uprise in violence that we're seeing across the country, mass shootings, right? People just going to the store and not being able to come out of the grocery store or being fearful to even go anywhere due to the level of crime and in most cases, senseless crimes, like we saw with the young girl from Ukraine. Just I her life ended, and she was doing nothing other than riding the train. So, we wanna talk about that from a different perspective, and we wanna talk and highlight some of the things that's been going on most recently in the past several weeks. So, I'm excited to introduce my guest, and we are actually starting from a place of being saddened and disheartened about some of the things that we've been seeing happen within the last couple of weeks. So, my guest today is Shotika Cox, and she's gonna come and have talk to you, tell you a little bit about her background, and then bring it in from a millennial's perspective and her perspective and why the examples that we're going to talk about today matter. So go ahead. Welcome, Shatika.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for having me. My name is Shotika Cox. In my day job, I guess you'd say I am a sales professional. I have a bachelor's of science in agricultural economics, and then I have a master's in urban ministry. I also am a published author, and I have been podcasting for several years. And I will preface this with all opinions are my own today, but really grateful for the opportunity to have a safe space to share some perspective on some of the different events we've seen in the news over the past month, 6 weeks, and have some healthy dialogue around that.
Well, in that tone, Shatika, would you tell us there were two issues that you brought up to me as to why you were encouraging me to have a dialogue on most recently there was the Catholic school shooting, Charlie Kirk, the woman that we talked about, young woman from Ukraine. Those were things that were heavy on your heart. Why do you think it's important for the dialogue that we're gonna have for the rest of this, conversation? Why do you think those things were important?
Yeah, I think I caution us not to become desensitized and to normalize just violence occurring. Oh, just another day, another mass shooting, another school shooting, right? And for me, I got concerned as I scrolled social media that maybe we were becoming apathetic. I would see someone, you can literally watch a video of someone being assassinated on the internet, and then you can scroll down. There's a happy birthday post. Oh, happy birthday, Susie. And then you scroll down and somebody posted their kids having fun at the park, and you can easily normalize that you just watched somebody being murdered live two posts ago. And so for me, it was really concerning, the level of apathy that I think was being built, but also the lack of empathy. I started seeing the bickering, between people. Hey, this is someone who I didn't agree with, so he died. And then there were people who were really grieving, right? And so just seeing the opposing views, the arguing, the jokes, the memes, if you will, the celebratory posts, right? That was really concerning to me. And so I called you expressing that concern and said, hey, you have an awesome platform for discussing these events, and an environment that even though we may not agree on the same things, we should be able to have a healthy conversation around it. And so I thought that this was a great opportunity to have those conversations.
Yeah, I agree with you. And what you're going to hear us talk about for the rest of the podcast is that we have these different views, and one might be extreme this way, one might be extreme that way. And I think what we want you all to think about is both can exist. I don't have to choose one over the other. I can actually, right, disagree with somebody's speech and what they're saying about people, but at the same time, agree that they shouldn't be assassinated for that. And so we're so excited from the perspective to have this dialogue, but we're also saddened because we also don't want it to be glorified when someone is, life is taken, especially somebody's life in front of their children. And I agree with Shatika. I had somebody have a conversation with me and say, but have you heard what he said about Black people? Have you heard what he said about this, that, and the other? And I'm like, yeah, I don't think anybody is going to say anything to where I would agree that they should be assassinated for those comments. Didn't believe it with Dr. Luther King. Didn't believe that George Floyd deserved to die that way, regardless of what's going on. And so I think that's what we want to leave today, leave you with, just different opinions and maybe some different ideas. And you don't have to have a different opinion when you hear this conversation, but we would ask you to be open-minded about the dialogue and what we need to do as a country in order to start reining in or at least challenging this ideology that it's okay to take somebody's life because you're dissatisfied or because you disagree with what they're saying.
And I would just say that made a valid point. I think that two things can be true, right? And so I do want to acknowledge that we are women of color. And I have heard some of the commentary that Charlie Kirk has had around DEI and some other things. And so I think that people's grief can look different, right? And so I think that two things can be true. One, maybe there's some things that we don't agree with, but also a wife and two young babies have lost their father. And so I think that while you could be offended with maybe some comments, you can also find it in your heart to be empathetic to the loss of life that someone has experienced.
Yes, I agree with you. It's not until we do that, this understanding exposure matters. When you are a lack of exposure matters, whether it's culture, whether it's finances, whether it's social economic status, what you've been exposed to is generally what you subscribe to, right? So there's an indoctrination across the board in different ways. And so I do think sometimes, especially as a former chief diversity officer, that people are truly ignorant to what they believe that they know. But I also understand that that doesn't change the person that's hurt or offended by the comments. So by no means are we saying you should not be offended, because you can be offended and offer grace. So whenever we get to a point where somebody being assassinated in front of their family, in front of their kids, in front of thousands of people who will never be able to get that out of their head, whenever we feel that that's justified, I think that becomes a scary place. I think that the political climate sometimes allows for, or what people think is because this is going on, I can respond this way, I can respond that way. And I think that's where we're kind of missing the mark. Um, we don't all agree with the same thing. And what made me want to talk about is I talked to several people who were, identify as Christian. and they were saying how, well, Tico, have you ever heard what the guy, and I'm speaking specifically to Charlie Kirk, has said about people of color or his tone or how he's approached things? You really should watch that. And so my response was, I will happily watch it, but let's be very clear. There is nothing that he's going to say that is going to make me come into agreement with him being assassinated. Right. And so that's when I started to see all of my friends and people in the circle have different beliefs. And the reason why I think this platform exists is because I believe in their ability to believe whatever they think makes sense for them. And so that's kind of where I was coming from. I didn't know a lot about them, but not that it's the same thing, but just like watching George Floyd be murdered on national TV. No matter what was done, it doesn't warrant this type of response. And so, with that being said, I'm going to ask my guests the first question. As we continue to see headlines about mass shootings and street violence and assaults on public figures, why do you think violence is rising across so many different settings in the United States, from church to the grocery store, right? To all of these just basic places, getting on a train. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's multifaceted. There's a lot of different reasons. I think, to my comment earlier about 2020, I think there's a similar unrest, from an economic perspective, right? Like, people are on edge. The economy is highly inflated. There's a lot of uncertainty. Unemployment rates are high, right? Like, there are a lot of things that are putting people on edge, that can cause them to act out. I think, the mental health crisis, is a big factor as well. And I think social media plays a big piece of that, just because what you mentioned about the normalization. People can go online. You could be young and you can be having a bad day, and you could go online and Google how to shoot up a school, or how do I get a gun, right? And so I think the accessibility of knowledge, as well as the normalization of what you see online, and then the easy access, to weapons, and getting these things, have all contributed to the increase.
Well, but my question is, though, this has been this way for quite some time, at least the last several years, where information has been accessible. We initially started, we were saying how the violent games that children were playing were leading to this. And so I guess what I'm trying to understand, so two things. One, it has been like this for a couple years that I can think of having access to social media. So I want you to kind of talk through why now when they've had access for a while. And then the second point that I want to clear, and this is where I have a little disagreement, because I think we often will blame stuff on mental health. And so not everybody that does a violent crime is a person struggling with mental health issues. I know that's easier for us to think and talk about, and I'm not saying that they're not, but this ideal of the first default is, hey, if a 10-year-old, walks into the school with a gun, and I will tell you, I read something on media today, and it was saying there was a woman, her 11-year-old son, I believe, was expelled from school because another student in his class brought a gun and he dismantled the gun. And so he was expelled. So I guess I bring that up to say that what mental health issues would we say that an 11-year-old had that would cause him to bring, a gun to school? And then what are we telling society if we expel the person who actually disrupted the harm? This was a armed gun, and the fact I was impressed that he dismantled it. So I know that that's a lot, but I'll turn it over to you, Shatika. Why now? We've had access to social media for quite some time where people are getting this information, and are we actually targeting the right thing?
So I think of mental health in a broader perspective, right? It's not just severe mental health disorders like a schizophrenia, right? But there are also the smaller, maybe people would categorize as a more common mental health issue of anxiety, right? Or depression. And for me, the high school experience and the middle school experience are very anxiety prone, right? And so when you think about a 10-year-old bringing a gun to school, it could very well be that they're struggling with anxiety or they're being bullied at school, right? And they're trying to figure out, how can I make this better? And so every case, of course, is not mental health, but I think that that is co- a contributor. Um, when we're looking at some of these cases, I think to your point about mentioning some of the violence we see in video games or even just in entertainment, in general, movies and things of that nature, I think that there are that group of individuals who want to play out fantasy, right, in real life. And so I think there's a lot of different things, but I want to specify that, of course, they're not all mental health, but I do think that there are varying degrees, right, and tiers. And so that a lot of that can be to even just the daily anxiety that one faces when going to school or the depression that they face because they're not making friends. Why now? I think I wouldn't say why now. I think we've seen an uptick, right, in mass shootings over the last several years. I think it just we continue to see the uptick. So I wouldn't say that social media hasn't had an impact because we've seen this happening the last decade. I mean, I grew up in Colorado, right? So Columbine and the Arapahoe movie theater shooting, right? And so we've been seeing this trend progressively pick up over the last several years, and I really do think that social media plays a part in that, and just I people have more access to things, and we know that the more information you get, it's not always beneficial, right? That could be a dangerous thing. But in this current environment, this current climate, I think that people are more bold. I think that everyone has something that they're standing up for and a point to prove, and especially with politics, right? Like people are so passionate about what they believe in that they're willing to go to the extreme for it. And so I think that this trend I mean, Charlie Kirk unfortunately lost his life, but we saw that there was an attempt on President Trump, right? And so I don't think that this is new, but I think that the climate, there's just a lot of unrest, a lot of tension, and people are on the edge, and so they're acting on kind of these urges and wanting to prove points.
Mhm. Well, I would say though, talk to me a little bit about so as you outline all of these different avenues, ways of getting information, because I feel like we all have access to it, but it doesn't lead us to a severe, non-reversible crime when you take somebody's life. And so, what would be your thoughts and comments about the young man, that assassinated Charlie Kirk? We've had a bunch of ideas floating around as to why, but what are your thoughts? Because that particular crime, was very well thought out. It was premeditated, and it was also this step-by-step execution of the plan. And so that to me is different from you just snap and you're in the audience or A, B, or C. That feels different to me beyond that I just consumed bad information. I grew up, it was a lot of stuff going on in the streets all the time. And my first, and we were actually in dangerous communities where you really could have been shot, growing up in generational poverty. And our first line of defense wasn't to go get a gun for the most part and shoot somebody. So what do you think those driving factors are in this particular case? And I know you can't say with 100% certainty, but based upon your last comment, what motivated him? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, you might be better at analyzing that with your background, right? But I think that people, at least my generation, and it seems like the Gen Zs and the younger generations, want to feel like they are standing up for something. And if someone is in opposition into what they feel is right, I don't know all the details about the shooter, but I know that he grew up um, conservative. I know that he grew up. I want to say either Mormon or Christian. I mean, it's Utah, so a big Mormon population. And I know that it was his youth pastor and his father who actually helped in bringing him in. But I also know that there was. Some knowledge about him having been in a relationship or dating someone who was transgender, right? And so, um, when you stand firmly on something, maybe you're in love with someone or you believe that who they are is who they are and there's nothing wrong with that, and there's someone else advocating and preaching a different message. I think that people feel like that's dangerous. Like what you're putting out into the world is dangerous, and I won't stand for that, right? So I think that many times that they believe that they're doing something right, right, and that they are taking a stand and defending maybe those who they feel like are voiceless, right, or the unheard or the unseen.
My challenge, my problems is more around the premeditation in a way that the plan was made. From
Yeah,
I think that's a
I mean,
different ballgame.
yeah, and I think only he knows that, right? But I also it brings to remembrance, right? Earlier this year, I believe it was. Yeah, I think it was earlier this year. So, I mean, this isn't the first assassination, if you will. The young boy who took out the United Healthcare CEO, right? And so I think when you have strong beliefs, right? That hey, the healthcare industry, the pharmaceutical industry is not doing right by people, even though that CEO is not in charge, right, of this whole industry, and he's not making all the decisions, right. He's looked at as almost an ambassador or a spokesperson, if you will, and it's kind of similar in that Charlie Kirk's, you know, these are just his views and his opinions, right? But he had a lot of influence. And
Well,
so
so did the CEO. I think that the CEO is actually an ambassador. When you step out, there's this idea that you're the face. I think of something as simple as Jake from State Farm, right? Now all of a sudden these commercials and he's representing the face of
sure.
State Farm. So if he goes and gets pulled over and has a DUI, that is absolutely a representation. Just whether inferred, whether I know it's just a job, but it is representation. So I'm wondering back to your comment about the CEO, isn't he actually responsible for contributing to some of the things going on in the industry?
Um, I think that yes, he plays a role, right? But he's not solely responsible, right? Everybody reports to somebody. And I think that again, it in this society that is so influenced by social media, right? It has a place. You're talking about a Charlie Kirk as a spokesperson with 8 million followers, right? That are following him on social media. That's big influence. And then you're looking at this CEO, right? And so I think when people are passionate about something and they feel like something is not right and that your message or your role is harming, right, the greater good, of the world, then I think that many people feel like that's enough, and I want to make a difference, right? Or I want to be known for trying to contribute to the greater good. And while murder and assassination is never the right way, right? I think that, you know, everybody has different beliefs about what does contributing to the greater good look like, right? And we don't know their thoughts, but that's a possibility.
Also think we have mismanaged expectations. My final question that I wanted to get to and talk a little bit about is what are the ways forward? So where the genie is out the bottle, social media, Facebook, X, TikTok, so they're not going back. AI is out the bottle, right? So from the perspective of being able to make deep fakes of people saying A, B, or C, so we can't put the genie back in a bottle. So I'm wondering what is the way forward? And before you answer that, I would say, as a person of color, that I think people of color have put up with a lot, right, for a really, really long time. And I just think it's interesting when we look, and not that people of color aren't committing some of these crimes, but when we really look at who's actually committing the crimes. I just feel like sometimes people of color are pushed to a limit to where I could see that their response could be violent, right? But I think there's some restraint in us wanting or thinking that a certain thing should be done or happen and then not doing it. So I just wanted to weigh in on what I feel like overall from the social media perspective that we all have very strong beliefs. You are not going to change somebody's perspective. And I want to integrate one quote that I love, and I don't know the author of it, but they said, conflict is inevitable, but combat is optional. Right?
Mhm.
So at some point in time, we don't agree, but how I respond, that combativeness or the lack of combativeness, right, is what determines the next step that I take. So with that being said, I just wanted to get that on the record. You talked to me about what's the way forward. How do we help your generation to see that violence is violence? Whether you're passive aggressive, it's still aggressive.
Sure. That's
Yeah.
a loaded question.
Yeah.
Um, um, I think platforms like yours are a great start to I think we have to create safe spaces for people to have differing opinions and views and for it to be okay. Like I want to be able to speak up and know that my grandma is still going to talk to me tomorrow because I have a different view, right? And so I think there was a quote by Thomas Jefferson, and he said, every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. And that to me is really
That's good.
powerful because a lot of times we believe the same thing, right? And we're trying to communicate and get to the same goal. But because our lived experiences are different, right? Our beliefs and the way that maybe we share that is different. And so I think having a safe space with open dialogue where you can truly say, "Hey, I'm gonna listen," right? They always say, God gave you two ears and one mouth, right? So you should be listening twice as much as you're speaking. And I think if we just get back to that, let me hear you out. Why do you feel that way? Why do you believe that way? well, this is how I feel, and this was my experience. And if we can genuinely have these conversations, I think it makes the world a difference. And it doesn't have to be on huge platforms. It doesn't have to be in front of 8 million people, but within your sphere of influence, right? Within your little community, right? Having these healthy conversations and being a space where people can come to and say, I feel this way. And I'll share a story. I actually have a coworker who, and I don't get into politics. So I don't say anything political really on social media, but this particular colleague does. And she was very vocal all of the election, like, hey, President Trump, President Trump, President Trump, right? This is the only way to vote. And I remember kind of when the DEI initiative started happening and some other things started happening that began to impact people close to her, people that she worked with, right? And I remember she came up to me and she said, I think you know where I stand and who I voted for. She said, I didn't think it was going to be this way.
Mm.
Right. And so I think you have to also allow people the ability to evolve and change, right? And I think we just say, no, you voted for so and so, or you feel this way, and I'm not speaking to you again. And so I think, again, just creating safe spaces to have these dialogues is really one of the biggest things that you can do. And if we were all having these safe conversations, right, in our small spheres of influences, it would make a great impact. And, we are believers and Christians, and the Bible says, as much as possible, live peaceably with all men. And so it should be our goal to try to be at peace with those we interact with on a day-to-day basis.
I totally agree. That's very powerful. It's a very powerful story, right? Of this ideal that I can sometimes make the wrong choice and the wrong decision. Um, and I can acknowledge that if you'll allow me to acknowledge that. So I think that I don't think a lot of people thought that some of the climate and some of the things would go the way that they went. I will tell you, if my son-in-law, which we was on here and we actually had a conversation, he approaches it totally from this biblical perspective of how do we govern ourselves. So that's a third opinion, right, that would differ from most people, and that's why this platform is important. And also, I will tell you, when you started talking about if my grandmother's still gonna talk to me, right? And so this ideal that you wanna be truthful, you wanna be honest, um, and people are not necessarily ready to receive that. And I'll say this piece. I had an example where, a friend had done something, and they said, "Hey, I'm hoping I didn't offend you." And so I thought, I can be honest, right? Because we're friends. And so I said, "Actually, I was offended." And then they got mad at me. They were offended that I acknowledged being offended. And it makes me think about this. How can I be honest with you where I was truly trying to be honest and say, "Hey, you asked me, I shared, and now we're going back and forth." And there's this negative dialogue because all I did was open up and tell you the truth. And then even told them, no, it was this piece that I wish you would have handled differently. So I do agree that this walking in the fence or not trying to problem solve is in itself becoming a problem. And so yeah, so I thank you for being with me today. One more example when we talk about politics is I remember when people were talking about Bernie Sanders and calling him a socialist, so forth and so on. And I remember telling somebody, hey, if he can get these student loans figured out, I will go on stand on the White House steps and let everybody know that I believe in Bernie, right? Because
Right,
my lived experience was that student loan debt was so high
right,
that I was willing to stay in one vein and be a one issue voter centering around student loans. So if we would be honest, right? Like that was my and I wasn't playing. And didn't know who Bernie was, but he was championing something that was so heavy for me that I was willing to say, yeah, he might not, be talking about this, but I'm okay with that. And I think we have to be honest with ourselves that the person I vote for might be the same person that you vote for, but we might be voting for two totally different reasons, right? And
Absolutely.
so honoring that space is what I think, um, that we're missing. I think that there's a fear that if I be honest, that it's not going to result in our friendship, that I might sincerely fall out with people, my coworkers, job, so forth and so on, and I don't wanna do that. So,
Yeah.
I wanna
To
give
just
you
chime
the
in to say that I think that, I know you're saying, "Hey, wrap it up," so I will wrap up with
No, no, no,
that
go ahead.
point that you're talking about. That's why I think that Thomas Jefferson quote is so profound because, hey, we might have different perspectives, but the same principle, and I have these conversations all the time because I see on social media, there's no way you're Christian and you're Democratic. There's no way you're Christian, right? And to your point, I was having a conversation with my husband. I said, people, we want to act like we're just voting on Christian values, but we're talking about social justice, right? And there are social justice and biblical issues on both sides, right? And so it's really yes, we are Christian, but people want to know what are you going to do to help me here on earth in my human experience? And that's why, hey, if you are in poverty, right? And you're struggling to get groceries, you need that government assistance, even though you're trusting in Jesus, right? It's a different lived experience than maybe someone in middle class who's saying, "Hey, I understand, where you're coming from, but I'm standing firm on, a traditional marriage, right? A man and a woman. We have two different lived experiences. So while we both believe in Jesus, we are voting on that experience here on earth. And so I think that we have to be cautious and judging people to your point of how they choose to vote because also, hey, I'm a Christian and maybe I do believe in the government assistance, but also I'm in this tax bracket and I don't want them to take more of my money, right? And so that might be your experience and that might be why you lean to. And so I think just understanding that, hey, people are business owners. And so they're voting based on that.
Yep,
And
yep.
people, maybe single moms and they're voting based on that and understanding that, hey, our perspective, our lived experience is different, but the principle is not, right?
All right, that's
And that,
very good. I was gonna
and
say, not to interrupt you, but to your point, I was that person. I was on every welfare program you could think of, Section 8, food stamps, Medicaid, all of those things, and I was like, "Hey, I need these things. I need assistance." And then as the years pass, and I'm trying to understand, why are you taking more money out my check? It wasn't until that happened that I really connected with being a taxpayer. I was used to getting these $5,000, tax return, and Imma tell you, even somebody in my family, I'm like, "Look, you ain't even worked." Right? And,
right,
like, how are you getting 4 or 5 grand back, and then I owe somebody? So it
right,
really is a reality, and I'm telling you what I
absolutely.
wholeheartedly felt. All of a sudden, I start saying, "Hey, can we get some people off the programs so we can lower tax brackets," right? Whole
Absolutely.
mindset shifted. But go ahead.
Yeah.
What were
No, and so I just think that we have to see that there are biblical principles on each, right? God is for the people and helping the orphans and the poor, right? He's also for life, right? But we can't say we're pro-life and we're not pro-life of the mother or the adult who's struggling, right, to pay their bills, right? And so I think that we just have to honor that, hey, people can share a principle even though we voted differently. And I think if, you having a platform like this to be able to share something like that in a safe space makes all the difference. And so, um, hopefully we can have more of that in the future
Yeah.
moving forward.
I'm really looking forward to that. I will tell you, I used to tell my students, I'd start off and it was a setup and I say, "Hey, let's talk about this beliefs on the death penalty. What do we think about this person?" And I'd show different people who were up there and they were like, "Yeah, he needs to die and they should execute him." And then I'd flip it and say, "But what if they killed your mom? What if it was your child that a bullet ricocheted off of somebody being mad? What if it was your family member? Would you still feel the same way?" I'd like to think that I would, but somebody hurt my kids, my grandkids, my family. I really would like to think that I would stay in the presence of the Lord. But I also know that there is a human response that I have to submit in order to not go out there and think that I'm gonna harm somebody even though they harm my family. And I said all that to say is that there is nothing wrong with people being upset, whether it's Charlie Kirk or whoever. But what we do need to get on the same page about is senseless murders. These types of murders, like the young woman on the train, totally unnecessary, unprovoked, right? And these are the things that I think we need to come together on and have the conversations. I can tell you right now, do I agree with everything that Shotika shared today or millennials? No, but I respect what she shared today. And I understand the space in which she comes from and millennials, right? I don't have that same experience because I haven't grown up in a social media culture, right? And so I don't necessarily see the direct correlation as she does. So, as we get ready to close, Shatika, I know your time is value. You got something to do. Um, what is there any last words that you would like to leave with the audience in regard to this uptake in violence or any solutions? And I know this platform is one, but how do we get the word out?
Yeah, no, I don't have a whole lot to say. I will say I'm not the voice of all millennials, right? There are several millennials who disagree with me. But yeah, I think, again, continue to try to have these conversations and healthy dialogues in your sphere of influence and um, be the change you want to see, right? And I think, I'll end with that quote that I feel is this whole essence of this conversation is we can disagree without being disagreeable.
I agree, and we don't have to be combated. That really was the thought behind this podcast, that I wanted and my guests want to demonstrate that we can have different opinions, and when I get off, we're gonna still be friends. I'm laughing. Shatika said if I say something at the table, grandma might not speak to me. I grew up in that era where that was a thing, where, you had to go back and beg grandma for forgiveness, for whatever, even if it wasn't your fault. So I do think that it's real that people don't talk about politics, don't talk about religion, don't talk about but these are all the things that need to be talked about. So anyway, so I want to give the last shout out to my guest. Thank you, Shotika Cox, my daughter, for opening up this dialogue and being passionate enough to share it, even though she and I don't have the same beliefs on all of it. In principle, I absolutely agree with what she's saying. How that plays out looks different from me, and it is influenced by my lived experience. So thank you so much, Shatika, from joining us. I would love to have your husband, who I think had a totally different take on this conversation, join us as we continue to bring these causes that matter to people's attention.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.